born in Santa Monica, California, but my parents were given a home as a wedding gift in Pacific Palisades, which at the time was very rural, actually. And the street that we lived on was called Kagawa, and it was a very small two-bedroom home and had a lot of vacant lots. I had kids that were my age, and we would get in trouble doing all sorts of things. We would dig holes in vacant lots and put boards over the top, and creative endeavors, I guess you'd say. A big change in my life happened because my mother died of leukemia when I was 7, and I had an older brother who was 11 at the time, and a sister who was just turning 4, and my youngest sister, Celeste, was 18 months old. So certainly a big change. And I would say one of the most influential people in my life was my aunt, whose name was Bernice, but everyone called her Aunt Bernie. And Aunt Bernie was a registered nurse, and so she kind of took on taking care of us. She would come in the morning and make breakfast for us and get us in our uniforms to go to school, and send us off. And then she would go to her apartment, which was in Hollywood, and sleep, and then go to work again at night. And she really helped support us when we were growing up. I mean, one of my sisters had braces on her teeth that she paid for, and it was a big part of my life. So when I graduated from high school, I ended up leaving the house in Pacific Palisades and living with Aunt Bernie, who lived in Hollywood. And I worked at a bank for about a year, and then through relatives, they paid my way. I applied and got into Art Center College of Design. And for me, who had never really done art, I had never taken art in school, and they gave you these long list of materials that you had to have, like, Winsor Newton paintbrushes and Winsor Newton gouache and certain kinds of paper and things, and I didn't even know what they were talking about, and it was all really expensive, of course. So, but kind of made my way. Ended up moving from Aunt Bernie about 4 blocks into an apartment over a garage, and with 2 kids that I had, they were my age, but I had met them through being a Girl Scout counselor. And at Art Center, one of them happened to be a dwarf, and her name was Beverly Armstrong, a fine artist, and she was only 3'10". And I walked into one of the life drawing classes one day, and she's sitting there with her feet straight out and her board on her feet, because it worked pretty well as an easel if you're that small. And I walked by her, and she was wearing a white regulation Girl Scout blouse. And I walked by and I said, "Nice blouse." And of course, she was completely surprised, but that's how we started this friendship, because I knew it was a Girl Scout blouse. So she called me, after about a semester and said, "I've been living with my aunt and uncle, and I need a place to live. Do you want to be roommates?" And so I said, "Sure." So she ended up being my roommate. And then another person that I also was a counselor with, the 3 of us had this tiny place that we had, and nobody had furniture, and we, built a phone booth out of a freezer box and painted it red. Had a fine time. It was a crazy, crazy time. I was also a counselor, a camp counselor, at a camp called Clear Creek that was up in the Angeles National Forest, and it was run by the Los Angeles City Schools. And one of the camp leaders was this man named Everett, and Everett and I became friends and ended up getting married. And so I went from this house over this small place and married, and we ended up living behind his mother's house in kind of a garage kind of thing. I don't know. We went from bad to the same. Anyway, so we lived there for a couple years, and then found a house in the Hollywood Hills that was right below the Hollywood sign, and it had an enormous leaded window that faced the Hollywood sign, and huge vaulted ceilings. It was a castle. It had turrets. It was, had incredible atmosphere. Everett and I lived there for 7 years, and then we ended up getting a divorce, and I moved to the Pacific Northwest because my brother Jim had moved up here. So I lived in Seattle, and I can remember being fascinated by being out on the streets, and there are all these people during the day that were outside, and you think, well, what do these people do for, what are they doing outside? Why aren't they working? Because, you know, I'd been a teacher for 7 years when I was in Los Angeles and married, and, you know, we both taught school. My husband, Everett, was a drama teacher, and so I played in the orchestra when they did musicals and, you know, helped do stuff at Wilson High School. And at the school that I taught, the Sylmar High School, which was in the San Fernando Valley, I taught three-dimensional design and jewelry making and stagecraft and yearbook. So I taught a variety of things. So when I came up here, my brother and I, you know, talked about doing a restaurant, a Mexican restaurant. And that's how I ended up buying the studio next to the parking lot. That was going to be a Mexican restaurant called Carmina's Veranda. But then, you know, the Mexican restaurant didn't work out, and I had this old house on this piece of property, and I inherited the parking lot. And of course, that ended up being, you know, the wisest decision that I ever didn't make intentionally. You know, people always say, God, you know, you are so smart to have bought that. And of course, I didn't buy it for any smart reason. It just ended up being smart in the long run, you know. That's the way life is, you know. Anyway, when I was a child, what I really decided I wanted to do was I want to work in museums, and I wanted to make the displays that were in the museums and the walls, you know, where they would show little villages and things. And I would take my allowance and buy models at the hobby shop and build these little models. So I was always interested in miniatures. And I think that kind of ran over into me starting to do these small jewelry pieces. I would say that the reason I got into doing these small sculptures is because Bainbridge Arts and Crafts asked me to do some show, and it was a while ago, certainly. And once I was given the idea, whatever the show theme was, you know, I would start to think about what I wanted to do. And it was always small because I've always been interested in small things. But my shop has all sorts of things to choose from in it because of my background in woodworking and jewelry making, certainly. And I know when I work, I think it happens with a lot of artists, you know, you start working on a piece and you work, and pretty soon I'm like, oh, shiny things. So, you know, I'm over here and I'm doing something, and then I go, oh, other shiny things. Oh, I'll go over there and we'll do something, you know. So this is kind of the way the process is for me anyway. It is not linear at all. You know, I start usually with some kind of drawing of what I'm thinking about I'm going to do, and then it takes on a life of its own. But it's been interesting to go back and look at the pieces that I've done, because when I work on them, and I think this is something artists do, and I hate it, is you don't do it until you have to. And so I end up working on these pieces until I am putting the last piece, and I've run out of time, on it, and I take it down to Arts and Crafts. And then I mostly don't see it again. And so I can't appreciate what I did because I am so involved in it that I'm tired of it. You know, it becomes so much pressure that you know, it's difficult to appreciate it. And I'm so close to it. Like one of the pieces that I did was called Radio Waves, and it's a little radio that's, you know, maybe this tall, and it has a boat on the top of it. And so I had to go up in all the wood that exists on this property, of which there is mountains of it. But I had to find a piece of wood that had that kind of crest for a wave coming off of it. I didn't care what the rest of the wood looked like, but I had to have that part of it. And so I started with that piece of wood, and then of course had to cut the rest of the radio so it looked like one of those pointed radios. But the top part is all natural, and that just happens to be the piece of wood that I found up there. But you know, they're small burls and things, so I worked small, you know, and so I have a full shop up there of just woodworking things. And of course, then I've also carved the signs for Linwood, for the Peter O'Connor and the bakery and all those. So that's the other end of the spectrum, and that's all wood that's up there too. So I go up there and go through the maple, go through the cedar and stuff, and find, you know, the pieces that I'm going to use to carve big signs. the biggest, of course, thing that I've done with woodworking is the gypsy wagon. And the gypsy wagon, you know, was one of these, again, these crazy things. You know, I said to Bob one day, God, it'd be really fun to build a gypsy wagon. And so the next thing I know, there's some man that lived in Silverdale and had all these wagons on his property, and he died. And so the woman was selling these wagons. So Bob brings 2 buckboards home and says, well, let's build a gypsy wagon out of one of these wagons. And so we contacted, through Deborah Cheadle, she knew someone other side of the mountains that restored wagons. And he said you could not build a gypsy wagon on a straight axle buckboard. You just couldn't, because it had to have springs. So we ended up selling him those 2 wagons, and he bought at auction the undercarriage for the gypsy wagon. I worked with a boat builder named Dave Sutter, who's a very accomplished woodworker, and he was kind of like the brains behind the wagon. I was the one that had to do the carving, which was really hard because you can't give it back once you've carved it away. So we worked together, and we worked for a couple of years anyway, building this wagon, and it became, you know, its own thing. I mean, if I had known at all that it was going to be so much work, I would have never attempted it. But trust me, I would have not started it, except Bob brings home these 2 buckboards. It's like, anyway. I'm enjoying traveling. You know, I've been doing quite a bit of traveling, and that's also fun. And one of the things I do when I travel is out of the United States is that I keep a journal, a daily journal, and I draw a picture every day. And I've been doing this for 30 years. And so over that time, out of all those travels out of the United States, I've probably drawn 2,000 pictures, and every day. And so in the early years that I was doing it, Bob and I would be somewhere, and Bob always he would always point out what he wanted me to draw, because there was usually a coffee shop there. And so he would say, don't you want to draw that? And no, Bob, not necessarily. I'll know when I want to draw something. So I would, you know, draw a picture a day, and then I would write kind of what we had done for the day. And it was a great way to keep a journal. And I have continued to do that over all these years. And they're all now in these books that are about this size with these beautiful leather covers. And I'm just about to start, I think, on my 7th book. And I don't know how many pages. They have about 250 pages per book. So I've been doing a lot of drawing, you know. But it's great to go back. You know, you go back 12 years to Croatia. And I can go back, and it absolutely puts me in that location, because I sat there and drew that particular picture. Like I said, I've just finished a book, so I'm just about to start the next book, the next adventure. Yeah.